And when I studied economics, my special subject was economic history. And when I did a doctorate in sociology, it had a strongly historical focus. So over 30 years, I've picked up something about the trade and practice of history. But I have absolutely no training in management. I have no clue for business, economics, despite my 2 degrees in economics. So I'm not going to talk to you about anything remotely connected with the education you're getting from my life. I'm going to talk to you about 2 things. In the first part of my talk, I'm going to give you some kind of context about the country you live in, which you are citizens. And in the second part of the talk, I'll give you some suggestions, perhaps advice, on how to enrich your life after you graduate from Myra. Enrich your life by cultivating interests outside work. That will be the second part of my talk. But the first part of my talk will be about the Republic of India. Now, I was born in 1958, which is 11 years after India became independent. If you say that a human being acquires some kind of adult consciousness at the age of 16 or 17, by the time I became an adult, we'd already been independent more than 25 years. Most of you in this room would have been born in the 1980s or the 1990s. In fact, 1990s is what I suspect. So for you, even the 70s and 80s are before your time. And in that sense, you're born into a country about whose history you know very little. You take it for granted. You take it for granted you're an Indian. Or if you're a Kannadiga, you take it for granted you're a Kannadiga. Or if you're from Mizoram or Nagaland, you just assume this is my state, this is my country. But how did that state and how did that country come into existence? What were the challenges it faced? How were they overcome? What can that complicated history of your country tell you about the challenges that India faces today? So I'm going to first talk about India as the Republic of India, not the civilization of India. The civilization of India may be thousands of years old, but the Republic of India is less than 70 years old. As political experiments go, it is relatively young. If you think of the French Revolution that occurred in 1789, that is almost 240 years ago. The American Revolution occurred even before. It will celebrate its 250th year 10 years from now. So, by the standards of most, at least mature democracies in the Western world, we are relatively young. But it's not just that we are young. We are, and this is a claim that I'm going to make, that comes from my studies of modern Indian history. We are the most recklessly ambitious as well as the most ambitiously reckless political experiment in human history. The Republic of India is the most ambitious experiment in human history, political experiment. Never before has a country so large and so diverse been run as a single nation. And never before have citizens, many of whom were illiterate at the time of independence, been granted the right to elect their own leaders. So the Republic of India is what I call an unnatural nation, as well as an unlikely democracy. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what this means, so that you have some kind of understanding of the country you are fortunate to live in. If you look at how nations were formed in 19th century Europe, you find that a nation was formed when people living in a certain territory were united on the basis of language and religion, and often a common enemy. So to be English, you had to speak the English language. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, as Great Britain as we now know it was being formed, there was a systematic attempt to standardize one language and make all citizens speak it. So minority languages such as Welsh, which is spoken in Wales, and Gaelic, which was spoken in Ireland and Scotland, were more or less extinguished. And a standard English with a standard grammar, a standard dictionary was made the national language. So every citizen had to speak English. Also at the same time, citizenship was identified with membership of the Church of England. The Church of England came about through a massive rift in the Christian church, a rift between the Protestants and the Catholics. The Catholics who believed that the center of the universe was the Vatican and Rome, and the Protestants who said no, every country can have its own church. So England was a country whose citizens spoke English, whose citizens were recognized as fully qualified to be citizens when they were members of the Church of England. In fact, the Queen is still today head of state and also head of the Church of England. So Catholics were discriminated against and Jews were discriminated against even more. And finally, England was formed as a nation by its citizens coming together to fight against France. So you have a common language, a common religion, and a common enemy. If you go across a border to France, you find the same thing in reverse. In the 19th century, the nation of France was formed. There's a great book by an American historian called Eugene Weber, Frenchman, which is called, shows how a nation of this diverse, distributed village communities is made to speak a single language. So like in England, a single language, in this case French, was imposed. Minority languages spoke, such as Breton spoken in Brittany, the language of the Basque country, all are basically given second rate status. At the same time, the dominant religion of France is Catholicism, so the Protestants are persecuted, which is the reverse of England. And just as England hated France, France hated England. So this is the template of modern nationalism. One language, one religion, one common enemy. And this is how the nations of 19th century Europe were formed. What I've told you about Germany and England, Germany and France, what I've told you about France and England also applies to Poland, to Germany, to Czechoslovakia, to Romania. Also one language, same religion, some enemy. Now, I sometimes argue, I've argued, not purely in jest, that Pakistan is a perfect European country. One language, Urdu, one religion, Islam, one enemy, India. Now, what is remarkable about the Indian political experiment is that under the visionary leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, and as continued under the very able leadership of his two great followers, Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel, who by the way were colleagues and comrades, not enemies as social media will tell you. If you want to know the truth about Gandhi, Patel and Nehru and their collaboration, read my book India After Gandhi. Stop going to Twitter if you want to know the truth. If you look at the way in which Indian nationalism was forged, Gandhiji recognized that a country so diverse could not have a single language. A country so diverse had to give every citizen the right to practice or practice his or her own religion. And that is why India is an extremely ambitious political experiment. Because unlike the other countries of the world, it is not united by a single language. If you look at the rupee note, there are 17 different languages, each of which have a different script. So we deliberately encourage linguistic pluralism. We allowed the people of Karnataka to speak Kannada. We allowed the speaker of Andhra to speak, to educate themselves, to administer themselves in Telugu, and so on and so forth. And of course we had English and Hindi as kind of linked languages, but there was no imposition. In the 1960s, people tried, the government of India, after Nehru died, the government of India tried to impose Hindi on Tamil Nadu. And the people of Tamil Nadu protested. And I'm proud to say, saved the union by rejecting Hindi. Many years later, this obsession with making a single national language continues. In 1989, when Munayam Singh Yadav first became Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, he wrote a letter to the Chief Minister of Kerala about some interstate collaboration, and the letter was written in Hindi. The Chief Minister, who was E.K. Nayanar in Kerala, replied in Malayalam. And this immediately stopped the Hindi chauvinism, because there are very few people in Lucknow who can read Malayalam. So, the extraordinary thing about the Indian political experiment is that its citizens are free to speak the language of their choice. they're also free to preach, practice, and follow the religion of their choice or no religion at all. I'm an agnostic. I was born a Hindu. I consider myself culturally a Hindu, but religiously I'm an agnostic. I don't worship. And that I have full freedom to do so. I could be a Jew, I could be a Buddhist, I could be a Parsi, I could be a Muslim, I could be a Christian, I could be a Hindu of different sects, and yet I could be Indian. And to be Indian, you don't even have to hate Pakistan. Please remember this. Please remember this. So I think this is the extraordinary thing about your country. In that we have shown that there is a different way to unite people living in a single territory. You can unite them on a common ideal of democracy, pluralism, social justice, economic development. You don't have to divide on the basis of language or religion. Now, long before you were, or any of you were born, perhaps long before even your parents were born, in the year 1956, which was before even I was born, in the year 1956, the state of Karnataka came into being. The state of Karnataka came into being as a result of an act called the States Reorganization Committee, a States Reorganization Act. This act mandated the creation of linguistic states. When we were ruled by the British, there were no linguistic states. So there was a Madras Presidency, whose capital was Madras. And in Madras Presidency, you had Tamil speakers, Telugu speakers, Kannada speakers, Tulu speakers, Marathi speakers, Malayalam speakers. In the east, there was a Bengal Presidency, whose capital was Calcutta. And in the Bengal Presidency, you had Bengali speakers, Odia speakers, Assamese speakers, Hindi and Magadhi speakers. Then you had a Bombay Presidency in the west, where you had Marathi speakers, Gujarati speakers, etc. Like Sindhi speakers and so on. Now, what happened in that kind of framework was, because the Madras Presidency was ruled from Madras, which was a Tamil city, the Tamils inevitably occupied the most dominant positions in the administration, and the Telugu speakers and the Malayalam speakers and the Kannada speakers were discriminated against. Similarly, in Bombay, because of Bombay being the capital, Marathi became the dominant language. And Gandhi recognized that this is unfair. So, and Nehru and Patel appreciated this. So in 1956, we were made a union of linguistic states. In the same year, 1956, that India bravely and boldly embraced the principle of linguistic pluralism. In that same year, 1956, in neighboring Sri Lanka, the Prime Minister of that time, SWRD Bandaranaike, said no. Based on the European model, every citizen must speak the same language. Sinhala will be the official language. Tamil was given second-rate status. And then commenced the civil war, which has still not ended. And when Bandaranaike imposed Sinhala as the sole official language of the island, a brave MP in Parliament, the opposition said, there were just two languages, two main languages, Sinhala and Tamil. He said, allow both equal status. And he said, two languages, one country, one language, two countries, or civil war. And if we had imposed one language in India, it would have been one language, 22 countries. So that is the great wisdom of our founding fathers. Likewise with religion. That regardless of what Pakistan did to its minorities, Nehru and Patel said, regardless of the ethnic cleansing of Hindus and Sikhs from West Pakistan, in India, Muslims and Christians and Parsis and Jews and atheists would have equal rights. So that is the first remarkable thing about our country that I would like you to understand and appreciate. That it's completely unique in this respect. It did not follow the standard models of nationalism. There were some people who thought this was a mistake. There were some people who thought Gandhi was wrong. And they wanted to impose a single language, a single religion. There used to be a slogan of the old Jansan, which went, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. He who speaks Hindi, he is a Hindu, only he is a proper citizen of Hindustan. Which is that actually, though the Jansan and now the BJP and the RSS claims to be great patriots and Swadeshi, they borrowed this model totally from the West. They are totally colonized. Because Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan is the same as English Protestant in England or French Catholic French So there were people who didn't understand the vision of Gandhi in recognizing that a country is so large, so diverse, so spread out, with such a rich history of pluralism. If you look at language, you know, if you look at language, each of our great languages, Kannada, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Gujarati, Odia, Bengali, I mean, they have literary traditions going on 800, 900 years. They are older than most European languages. And people are deeply attached, you know, they sing the poetry, the folklore, the music of these languages. And you want to just impose Hindi on all of them? Just think of what violence that imposition of Hindi would have done to the richness and diversity of India. Likewise with religion. There have been Christians in India much longer than in Europe. The Christians in Kerala date to the 1st century. There have been Muslims in India since at least the 8th century. And of course, Parsis, Jews, Sikhs, Jains have all flourished on this land. So, at various points in our history, there have been attempts by, I would say, misguided or narrow-minded people to impose a single language or a single religion as a litmus test of citizenship. And fortunately, they have failed, because the greatness of India is its respect for pluralism and diversity. If India had gone the way of Sri Lanka, it would have been 22 bleeding states today. Not just Sri Lanka, look at Pakistan. Pakistan came because Jinnah said, we can't live with the Hindus, so we need our own country. But that country had a western wing and an eastern wing. Okay? Now, the western wing, they decided to have Urdu as their national language. Jinnah goes to Dhaka in East Pakistan and said, all of you have to speak Urdu. But they all speak Bengali, and they are proud of the poetry of Tagore and Qazi Nazrul Islam and their great tradition of drama and folklore. They say, no, Bengali is our language. We may be Muslim, but Bengali is our language. And the Pakistanis tried to impose Urdu, which whereby begins the slow process where there is a civil war, as in Sri Lanka, though unlike in Sri Lanka, it actually resulted in the division of two countries and Bangladesh finding its own feet as an independent nation. And what happens when you impose a single religion? When you impose a single religion, you more and more impose a certain version of the religion. So in Pakistan they say, we are an Islamic country. But who is the true Muslim? So Shias are persecuted in Pakistan. There are two great sects in Islam, Sunni and Shia. Jinnah himself was a Shia. But Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, would not have been safe in Pakistan today, because the Sunnis are attacking the Shias. Ahmadiyas, who are another sect, they say, no, you are not proper Muslims, so we will beat you up, we will persecute you. So you don't stop with the Hindus and the Sikhs. You stop with, you go on. And then you go on, and a particular group of fanatics acquires the right to define who is the true Muslim. Now, if we had followed that model in India, what would have happened? I would not be speaking before you today. Because I would be told you are not a true Hindu because you don't believe in the Ram temple in Ayodhya. Forget me. Of course, Muslims, Christians, they first got after the Muslims and the Christians, just as in Pakistan they first went after the Hindus and the Sikhs, but they would not have stopped there. You say, true Hindu means this. There means a group of mullahs, like the Taliban, we had a Hindu Taliban. Just as in Pakistan you have a Muslim Taliban, saying, only this is correct. This is the path, this is the path, this is the path, and if you deviate, I will shoot you, I will persecute you, I will exterminate you. So this is the greatness of Gandhi, that he and Nehru and Patel who followed him, and the great Dr. B.R. Ambedkar who wrote the Constitution, as a member of Nehru and Patel's cabinet, recognized that our great strength is our diversity. And forget what happened in Europe. Forget what Pakistan is doing. We will elaborate a model of nation building that will celebrate rather than deny diversity. That's the first thing I'd like, first important lesson or first important historical truth about our country I would like to leave you with. The second is that not only are we what I call an unnatural nation, we don't follow the European model of a nation building, we are also an unlikely democracy because we did not follow the European model of how to conduct elections. If you look at the progress of democracy in the West. Everywhere across Europe and North America, the vote was granted in stages. In England in the 18th century, only men of property could vote. In the 19th century, the privilege was extended and educated men could also vote. Later on, in the late 19th century, after a struggle by the working class, all men, regardless of education or property, were allowed to vote, but women were still denied the vote. And in the 20th century, in the early decades of the 20th century, there was a remarkable movement called the suffragette movement, where European women peacefully protested so that they could also vote. And actually Mahatma Gandhi was in England in 1906 and 1909, and he saw the sacrifice of the suffragettes, their willingness to be beaten up, to be jailed, to be harassed, to be trampled over, to demand the human right to vote. And Gandhi was deeply impressed by this. And his whole part of the impetus for his own idea of satyagraha came from watching the women protesters in London in 1906 and 1909. So finally that struggle succeeded and women were granted the vote. But it was a slow process everywhere. It was staggered. In fact, it will surprise you to know that in Switzerland, which is supposed to be a very advanced European country, in Switzerland, in some parts of Switzerland, as late as 1971, women did not have the vote. So that is the model, that you have to be rich, prosperous before men can vote, and slowly you grant the vote to women. But what did we do? Ambedkar and Nehru, when they wrote the constitution, said no. As soon as we have a constitution and we have an election, every Indian, regardless of gender or education or property or class background, will have the vote, because every Indian is equal and every Indian must have the same right to elect his or her leader. And this promise was first made in 1928 by the Congress, well before independence. When across the West you did not have universal adult franchise, the Congress of Gandhi and Nehru, which by the way is totally different from the Congress of the Nakli Nehrus and the Nakli Gandhis today. So don't confuse the Congress of the 1930s with the Congress of today. The Congress of the 1930s was a great non-dynastic party, including many remarkable leaders from across the country. So, in our constitution we said, every person will have the vote. And people thought this is utterly foolish. How can you give illiterate people the vote? You know, they said this is the biggest gamble in history. You will not have a second election, but we had a second, a third, a fourth. In 1967, a journalist of the London Times came to India and said, how can you give poor people the vote? They are so foolish. Surely a military dictatorship will follow. And in the London Times, which was then the most influential paper in the world, there was an editorial saying that this general election in 1967 will be the last general election India will ever hold. But we defied them. And in fact, universal adult franchise has deepened democracy. Because everyone, at least however they are treated in everyday life, women may be abused in the household, but when they go to vote, they have the same rights. Dalits may be discriminated in the village, but when they go to vote, they have the same right. Even in areas where there is insurgency, for example, in the Naxalite areas of central India, the Naxalites don't believe in voting because they are opposed to democracy. So they give a poll boycott to the Adivasis. The women wear their best saris and go and vote. In the northeast, same thing. Kashmir, same thing. So as our former Chief Election Commissioner, J.M. Lindo once said, the one day on which all of India is united is the day of the general election. And I think just as linguistic and religious pluralism keeps us together, voting also keeps us together. So I hope all of you have voting cards, and I hope all of you vote. Because that's the one fundamental right of every citizen, regardless of class or gender or what have you. Now, because of its size, because of its diversity, because of its remarkable and innovative experiment of deepening pluralism, not flattening it in the name of a single language or single religion, India is, without question to my mind, the most interesting country in the world. It also could be the most exasperating. If I was a historian born in Sweden and working in Sweden, probably I would have better roads, I would have cleaner air, I would have more efficient traffic policemen, but I would have a boring existence. I would not know what book to write. It's not just for you, people like you, who are not going to write. Some of you might write books, but you just think of the rare privilege you have. It is extraordinary country, so rich, so diverse, undergoing this remarkable experiment of unity and diversity, of electoral democracy despite desperate poverty. And so keep your ears, your eyes, your senses alive to the extraordinary political experiment this is. It's an old civilization, but a new nation, and a new nation whose visionary founders refused to go down the standard model of one language, one religion, one nation. I'm speaking just outside Mysore. For many years, there was a very distinguished professor who taught in Mysore. He later moved to Bangalore and died there. The great writer U.R. Ananthamurthy. And Ananthamurthy said something very interesting. He said, just something similar to what I said about it being a great privilege to be a writer born in India, but he put it differently. He said, if you are a writer born in England, okay, today, so let's say a famous English writer, Julian Barnes, or Martin Amis, who's a well-known novelist, or Salman Rushdie, who's essentially English. You think of them today. To them, Shakespeare, and who was a 16th century figure, and Chaucer, who was a 13th century figure, two great English writers, they are distant. They are only found in libraries. They are foreign to you. To Martin Amis or to Salman Rushdie, Chaucer and Shakespeare are distant. But to an Indian, Ananthamurthy said, Kalidasa and Pampa are still my contemporaries. He said, in India, you lived in the 12th century and the 21st century simultaneously. And I would add something more to what Ananthamurthy said. You lived simultaneously in the 12th century and the 21st century and all the centuries in between. It's this extraordinary depth, historical, civilizational depth of India, combined with its social and cultural diversity, combined further with the remarkable visionary political experiment of deepening this diversity, democratic template, putting on it, makes India such an interesting and exciting place to live. And as you study in Maya, as you graduate and go across your journey in life, I want to urge you to think a little about this country you live in and how you can soak in its colors, its smells, its textures, its beauties, its historical and civilizational depth. I said when I began, I have no training in business or management. I cannot advise you on how to become better or more successful managers. I cannot advise you on how to become more innovative entrepreneurs. Your faculty will take care of all of that. But I thought in the second part of my talk, tell you a little bit about how you, as young married women, about to embark on a profession in this country, how you can combine your commitment to your profession with an interest in and appreciation of life outside your profession. How can you? There's a kind of a phrase that is relatively recent in currency. It must be over the last 20 years. It is called work-life balance. Work-life balance. You all know about it. What is work-life balance? Work-life balance is you go to work at 9, you come back at 6. Then you open if you are married, you pay regular attention to your partner, maybe to your children. If you are not married, you come back, you're tired, you open a can of beer, and you put on the TV and you watch the IPL. That's not my idea of work-life balance, by the way. Family and children, yes, but not IPL or serials or soaps or whatever you're downloading on your various gadgets. That's not what I mean by work-life balance. I want you, all young people, to think of work-life balance as consisting in the life part. The work part, as I said, I cannot advise you. I have no competence to tell you how to become more successful managers or entrepreneurs. That's not my job. But in the life part, I want to say a little bit in the second and concluding part of my talk on what I believe are the three great glories of human achievement. These are music, especially classical music, art and architecture, and of course literature, which includes poetry, plays, novels, stories, folklore, and so on. And I want to say a little bit about how it's never too late to cultivate an interest in art, music, and literature, and to say that this can give you nourishment of a kind, emotional, intellectual, aesthetic, spiritual nourishment of a kind. No website, no television program, no cricket match ever can. And maybe I'll start by saying a little bit about what this has meant to me. I grew up in Dehradun in northern India, and in my family no one listened to music. So happened, in my nuclear family there was no interest in music. But I developed an interest in music. This is the 1970s. This is when the Beatles were just coming up, so there was very good folk music in the West. This is when there was superb film music. In fact, Hindi film music of the 50s and 60s was absolutely fantastic. You know, based on folklore and folk songs and classical music. So you had, and great singers. I mean, Mohammad Rafi, Kishore Kumar, Lata Mangeshkar, Mukesh, great composers, Naushad, S.D. Burman, I mean, fabulous. So I would listen. The radio was my window to the world. You know, in those days there was no television. You had a radio. And the radio, you had no internet, of course. And of course you had no television. You had one channel, Doordarshan, which was boring and basically gave government propaganda. So your radio was your window to the world. So you listen to Vivid Bharati for film music, you listen to BBC, Radio Ceylon for Western music, you listen to BBC for news, for features, for book discussions, for plays read aloud. So the radio was how I cultivated interest first in the best of Western popular music, which was at that time the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan, and the best of Indian popular music, which was Hindi film music of the kind I talked about. But I had no interest in classical music. However, it so happened that I was an asthmatic, a lifelong asthmatic. I don't know, are there any asthmatics in this room? Well, okay, so at least there's one person who will understand what I'm talking about. Here is my carrying card of being an asthmatic. So asthma is you have an attack at night. So you get breathless and you have what's called a spasm. And then you take a pill, but you're kind of exhausted by that, you can't sleep. And in those days, medication now is much better. In those days, there was a pill, the only major pill, the only pill that stopped your spasm. I mean, if you didn't take a pill, asthma can actually, you could have a cardiac arrest, so you had to take the pill. If you didn't take the pill, if you took the pill, it stopped your spasm, it made your breathing a little easier, you were more comfortable. But that pill also kept you awake. You know, it had one of the components of the pill was kept you awake. So, which is another reason why the radio became my companion, because I had to kill 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the night, 12 to 3, before I could go back to sleep. So one night, when I was about 16, I had an attack. And I got up and I started fiddling around, and the knobs of my radio, and it was 2:30 a.m. And on what was then called the General Overseas Service of the All India Radio, I heard the Shehnai play, and I kept it on. And it played and played and played, and it just captivated. I said, this is different, this is special. Beatles are nice, Mohammad Rafi is nice, but this is magical. And from there, I developed an interest in classical music. When I went to university in Delhi, it so happened that 2 of my friends were interested in classical music. They would take me to concerts. And it so happened that Ali Akbar and Ravi Shankar were still playing. The greatest sarod player and the greatest sitar player of their time. And they would play a Jugalbandi in honor of their common guru. Every year there would be an all-night concert at the Model School grounds in New Delhi. And I kept on listening to more music. I would listen to All India Radio. And that has really sustained me now for 40 years. By the way, that Shehnai player was Bismillah Khan. So it was a special Shehnai player who hooked me onto music. And the rag he played was Durga, which is still one of my special parts, a favorite part. And what classical music can do to you, is, it could be Carnatic, It could be Western. But it requires training. It requires not training, that's the wrong word. It requires practice. It requires hours spent. So if any of you has an instinctive, some of you may come from families which, unlike mine, have a grounding in classical music. Some of you may already be listening to classical music. Others of you may be wondering, is this something, my friends don't listen to it, is this cool, is this kosher, But if any of you have an inkling towards it, the only way to deepen it is to listen more and more and more and more. You go to enjoy, to appreciate, empathize, immerse and soak yourself. And it's just quite extraordinary. Now you have what I don't have, which is YouTube. Now, which in terms of classical music is just astonishing. I have some years ago I broke my leg. By the way, I'll tell you, I'll tell you stories of how I'm asthmatic. Now I'm going to tell you a story of how I broke my leg. I don't recommend either of you become asthmatics or break your legs to appreciate classical music. But it so happened it worked for me. So first of all, 40 years ago, I listened to Bismillah Khan while having an asthma attack. Then I deepened my interest in classical. 2 years ago, I broke my leg. I was hauled up in bed. And all I had was my laptop. I couldn't walk, I couldn't read, I couldn't really work. So one day I got a friend of mine sent me a link to a composition, which is a famous composition of a folk saint in Karnataka called Krishnani Begani Baru, which is about a hymn to Krishna as sung and as worshipped in the Udupi temple. And it's been one of my favorite kind of things of mine. But when I clicked on this, I think the one that I was sent was by T.N. Krishna. On the right, other versions came up. By M.L. Vasantakumari, by M.S. Subalakshmi, by Yasudas, who was a Christian singing a hymn to Krishna, by John Higgins, who was an American who learned classical music. And I spent the whole morning listening to different renditions of Krishna in Begani Baru. And now, this is 4 or 5 years ago, and what YouTube has expanded and expanded and expanded and expanded. So that's the first great achievement of human civilization. Far greater than any celebrated in the business pages of a newspaper. Far greater than what Steve Jobs did with Apple, or those are great enough. I mean, I use an Apple, so I'm grateful to Steve Jobs, by the way. But so classical music is one of the great achievements in human civilization. The second is literature. Novels, poetry, plays. Now this is something I grew up with, because I read. I came from a family that did not listen to classical music, but fortunately they read. There were books, serious books, novels in the home, and I read and I read and I read. And the joys of curling up with a book at night on a train, you should find your own path. Literature, I won't guide you. You should find your own path. But do read widely. Do read in all genres: poetry, plays, fiction, non-fiction, history, biography, and find literature is again a way of understanding the human experience. That is unrivaled. And the third is art and architecture. To this I came even later. Music I discovered through All India Radio. Art and architecture I discovered only because I had the fortune to be married to a graphic designer. And more architecture than art. I said I'm an agnostic. But there is, without question, the finest music in the world, classical music, both Western and Indian, Carnatic and Hindustani, is a product of devotion to a divine being. Similarly, the finest architecture in the world is in our temples, our churches, our mosques, built when people all were believers. The 21st century temples and churches are decidedly commonplace, even ugly, compared to our medieval temples or churches or mosques. And there is nothing I like better than to visit an old temple or an old mosque or an old church and just walk through it, appreciating its beauties, its designs, its lighting, what's there on the ceiling, what the paintings are, what the sculpture is like, what the whole ambiance is like. Never worshipping in it. I was last week in Burma, in Myanmar, and Myanmar is largely Buddhist, as you know. The capital, Yangon, has a great Buddhist pagoda called the Shwedagon, which is that shining golden disc coming right up into the sky. And it was first built in the 6th century, and slowly it was added and developed up to the 18th century. And it dominates the city. Unfortunately, the city planners in Yangon have allowed you to get a view from it wherever you are. So you know where you are, wherever you are, you can see the Shwedagon. And if you go into it, it's almost a temple city. It's like, the great temple in Tanjavur or the Madurai Meenakshi, or the Jama Masjid in Delhi. It's huge, and there are byways and there are small shrines and so on. That is in Yangon, the Shwedagon. But I also went to a place called Bagan, which is in the interior, which is in the dry zone of Myanmar. And along the river Irrawaddy, here in Bagan, you have more than 1,000 Buddhist shrines of different sizes and shapes. Not one grand dominating presence like the Golden Pagoda of the Shwedagon in the capital, but along the river plain, spread out, more than 1,000 temples and shrines built between the 9th and the 13th century, when Bagan was capital of the whole of Burma. And it's extraordinarily beautiful. It's a wonder world. It's, as I was telling your faculty members last night, it is Hampi plus plus plus. Because Hampi is also on the banks of the river, but the Irrawaddy is much grander than the Tungabhadra. Hampi has quite a few nice shrines, but this has, of all sizes and shapes and blended beautifully into the countryside. And what an hour or two, or a day or two, or indeed a week or two, walking through, soaking in the beauties of medieval architecture, of any faith, of the Islamic faith, the Hindu faith, the Christian faith, the Buddhist faith can do to you, is something immeasurable. Now, I spoke about the three great glories of human achievement: music, especially classical music, literature in all its forms, and art and architecture. And beyond these three great glories of human achievement, beyond what humans can do, there is the wonderful, inexhaustible world of nature itself. I was fortunate in growing up in Dehradun before it became a capital city. So it was still green and verdant with wonderful, wonderful forests, sal forests. Dehradun is in the foothills. It's in between the Shivaliks and the Himalaya. So there are lots of migratory birds. It's over 300 species of birds in Dehradun. So without trying, I became a bird watcher. Without trying, I came to appreciate the beauties of bird and animal life. But later on, of course, other kinds of creations of nature. If you look at art, music, literature, and nature, no country has greater riches to offer than ours. Africa may have greater and grander natural spaces, but it does not have the richness of our musical aesthetic traditions. Europe has fabulously beautiful churches, perhaps more beautiful in some ways than our temples, but it does not have our ecological and natural diversity. And this is something I would urge you to cultivate as you go in your journey through life. India's cultural and aesthetic and natural treasures taken together are unmatched in any country in the world, and each of our states is itself fabulously well endowed. Each of our states, is like has very rich and diverse musical, aesthetic, literary, and traditions, and each of our states has wonderful landscapes and natural areas. Think of Karnataka. Karnataka, we are close to Mysore. Mysore was a great patron of classical music, the Maharaja of Mysore. Till recently, there were some superb classical musicians in Mysore. There probably are still some. One of my favorite Carnatic musicians, Veena Doraiswamy Iyengar, lived here for many years. The Maharaja himself was an accomplished musician. Bangalore is Delhi of Dharwad, which is an extraordinary center of classical music. If you look at the great vocalists of the 20th century, it's striking how many come from near Dharwad and Hubli. Kumar Gandhar, Gangubai Hangal, Basavaraj Rajguru, Mallikarjun Mansoor, Bhimsen Joshi are all from there. One of the finest contemporary classical singers, whom if you get a chance you must listen to, is a man called M. Venkatesh Kumar, who comes from Dharwad and lives there. So at Bangalore itself, where I live, fortunately has both Hindustani and Carnatic classics. which is rare among Indian cities. Pune is a great center of Hindustani classical music. Chennai is a great center of Carnatic classical music. But Bangalore we have both. For those who love Carnatic music, and you live in Bangalore, there is a Ram Navami concert season, Ram Navami festival, a music festival extending over a month during the period of Ram Navami. Like Hindustani music, there are various sabhas. I am a member of an organization called Sur Sagar, which has wonderful concerts throughout the year, including also some really gifted young musicians. And every city in India, has, and of course, I talked about YouTube, but there is nothing like going to a concert. YouTube is nice enough, but to go live to a concert and hear a great artist is just, again, it transports you into another realm. And when I was, and the closer you are to the artist, the more you can appreciate. So when I was young, I couldn't afford the seats in the front row, or the second row or third row. I would have a seat right at the back. At half time, I would quietly sneak into the front row because all the VIPs would have gone. They would have shown their face and pushed off. And I would get ghost quietly at less than second half. Now that I'm old and reasonably well known, even if I don't have a ticket, I can walk to the front row and sit down. And if someone stops me, I say press, press, press. Most cities of India have kind of these concerts. In Karnataka, luckily, Bangalore is the center of Carnatic and Hindustani music. And as I grow old, as I grow young, as I was young, nothing gives me greater pleasure than attending a concert by a remarkable musician. I'll tell you a story about this. Some of you know I write on cricket, and I'm still very keen on cricket, only test cricket. But I am now at an age, I have been for some years, the last 5 or 6 years, I realized that something had happened to me in my early 50s. I was appreciating a good concert much more than a Tendulkar innings. I think I had grown, I had matured, at least spiritually matured. And aside of this, one day I was in Delhi, checking into a hotel. And next to me was the Hindustani classical musician I most admire. He is a Maharashtrian who now teaches at the Sangeet Research Academy in Kolkata. His name is Ulas Kashalkar. Some of you might have heard him. He's probably the most distinguished living male vocalist in the Hindustani tradition today. So I was checking in. He had just checked in, and I was looking at him. I said, "Do I go and introduce myself?" As I said, my passion used to be cricket. Now it's classical music. When I was your age, and if Bishan Singh Bedi was checking in next to me, I would say, "Sir, autograph," at once. No. And I had the veneration to Ulas Kashalkar today, which is comparable to the veneration I had to Bishan Singh Bedi when I was 18 or 20, because he's a much greater person than me, without doubt. But I said, look, he's special. Do I want to embarrass him? Do I want to intrude to his privacy? He's thinking music, he's thinking about the concert he will sing. Do I really want to mess around with him? And I let it go. But that's the kind of feeling I have about great musicians. And it comes from a lifetime of listening and learning. And I would say, next to my family, it's really music that has given me the greatest pleasure and consolation. Up to Chandrasekhar Kampar. And many of them are in English translation. In terms of nature, again, Karnataka is fabulously well endowed, from the Western Ghats to Kodagu, right here in your vicinity, the Rangan Bird Sanctuary, the Nagarhole National Park. So, and what is true of Karnataka in terms of its depth of its literary traditions, in terms of its richness of its art and architecture, in terms of the sophistication of its literature and theatre, in terms of natural beauty. What is true of Karnataka is true of most major states in India. It's true of Maharashtra, it's true of Tamil Nadu, it's true of Kerala, it's true of Andhra, it's true of Telangana, of Gujarat, of Bengal, of Rajasthan, whatever. So, I've spoken a little bit about art, music, literature and nature. Not every one of you can sustain a deep and cultivated interest in all of it. No one can, no. As I said, as far as I'm concerned, literature I live. So, because that's my lifeblood. music comes second, art and architecture do a little bit, and nature I don't have much time for anymore. You can't really do it. I mean, if all you were doing is cultivating a deep and serious interest in art and music and literature and nature, you would have to be born a very rich man, somebody else would be paying your bills. You would have inherit wealth. So I want to tell you that obviously it's beyond the realm of a single individual as he or she goes through life to cultivate a serious interest in all for it. But if you have an incipient interest in one of them, if you're a photographer, go into the wild. If you have a ear for music, go beyond popular music into classical music. If you have an eye for art, go beyond modern art into classical and built architecture. And you will find that even one serious interest, for me it's music, the most serious. For someone else it could be photography and nature, for a third person it should be art and architecture, for a fourth person it could be poetry and theatre. But even one cultivating whatever you're oriented most towards at your age, in your early or mid-20s, whatever it's you're most inclined towards, you may be more inclined towards music or nature or literature or architecture, doesn't matter. If you just cultivate this deeply and seriously, it will give you the kind of pleasure, the solace, the consolation, the upliftment that nothing else. Thank you very much. Just get up and speak up. Yeah. When you speak out this, you have to pass out the mic. The recording is speak to the mic.
Sir, we know that you are a great cricket historian as well.
Yeah.
One of the cricketers less spoke about in various sections of media is Rahul Dravid. He always walked the path in silent mode. He doesn't have great farewells. There is nothing as celebratory as Sachin Tendulkar in media.
Yeah.
So please give us some glimpse of how he impacted the Test cricket in India and in globe as well. I mean, across the world as well. How he impacted the Test cricket.
Rahul Dravid.
Yeah.
He was a great cricketer. I think the important thing is as you grow older, you realize that you don't have to pick. When you're young, you pick. When I was younger, when I was your age, the great debate among cricket lovers was Gavaskar greater or Vishwanath? Right. The great debate among classical music lovers when I was young in the 70s was Ravi Shankar the best sitarist or was Vilayat Khan the best sitarist? As you grow older, the privilege is that you don't have to choose. You can admire Tendulkar and Dravid both. So that's, it so happens that Sachin caught our imagination for a particular reason. Because of his youth. Because of the dash of his stroke play. Because India was going through a turbulent period where he was Kavigari 90s, Babri Masjid, all of that, and then, he gave a certain kind of. So it's a certain, but I would say, before I come to Dravid, much more underappreciated than Dravid is Anil Kumble. Yeah. Because bowlers win test matches, not batsmen. You need to take 20 wickets to win a test match. You may score 1,000 runs and you still won't. And Anil Kumble has won more test matches for India than either Dravid or Tendulkar. But we are totally a batsman's game and driven totally by obsession with batsmen. If Anil Kumble had been made captain of India 5 or 6 years ago, before he would have been a very successful captain. Shane Warne would have been a fantastic captain, but there is a prejudice against bowlers, so he was not made captain. So for me, bowlers come first. No, I was a bowler myself. So I would say this. So I admire Dravid and Tendulkar. For me, Kumble is the underappreciated one. And for me, it has come to India. I wrote a column some time ago about how when I go to sleep, as you get older, it's harder to go to sleep. There's a problem. I had to learn myself to sleep. There was a time I would think about my youth, about the forest, the fields, the rivers. Now I think either of Shane Warne or Wasim Akram, the two most perfect bowlers that I watched. Shane Warne, Wasim Akram. So the first thing I'd like to say is, spare a thought for bowlers. Bowlers win matches. And it's a shocking prejudice that young people like you should not have. Advertisers have it. Ads are all Virat Kohli. Though Ashwin and Zaid Khan may be winning you the matches, the ads are Sehwag and Virat Kohli. So that's the first thing I want to urge all of you who love cricket. Bowlers win matches and test matches are only one. Why does England do well? Because of Anderson and Broad today. Why are they, it's not because of Cook and Root, who are good, Cook and Root are very good, it's because of Anderson and Broad. Now about cricket, I'll tell you a story about Dravid. I won't comment on his cricket. I know him a little bit. Not well. In 2007 or 8, 2007, he was captain of the Indian touring team to England. And in the test matches, I think he won after a long time. There were one-day matches going on. And this is the time I had broken my leg, I was telling you. So I was watching on the TV, one-day matches. Now, Dravid is a magnificent stick fielder also. The most remarkable thing about Dravid is that an Indian holds the record for most catches. That's his record. So I was watching this on TV, and Zahir Khan was then bowling. Wonderful. And Zahir Khan would bowl. He would get an edge. Strauss would get an edge, but there some joker would drop it because Rahul was fielding at mid-off. He thought as captain he has to guide the bowler. So it happened in one or two matches. So I wrote him an email. I said, dear Rahul, I'm watching these matches. But I'm wondering why you're fielding at mid-off. Can't you see, very important to get Andrew Strauss out early and Zahir is finding the edge, but no one is catching it. So then he wrote back. Dear Ram, so nice to hear from you. Just last week, I walked into Blackwell's bookshop in London and I picked up your book India After Gandhi. It had come out just that year in a British edition. And I started reading it and I'm fascinated. And the chapter on princely estates is so good. And I'm looking forward to reading it with warm regards, Rahul. Maybe say, you stick to your job, I stick to mine. So that is my favorite Rahul story. So I will never give a cricket advice. He never said, but he just said, I bought your book, it's very good, shut up. Go on. Yeah, sorry.
Spoke all of us about the greatness of India, the democracy experiment. I just want you to highlight about why Indian women should be very proud of our constitution and the experiment, particularly for the, I would say, without any distinct Hindu because of the Hindu act. Because, as you were saying, sometimes you get up in the middle of the night. It was one of those days when, I read your book only about 2-3 years back. So I couldn't sleep, and then I was reading that particular chapter where, this particular act. Then, she was went down there. If it hadn't happened, probably I wouldn't be what I am today in India.
I think much more needs to be done on that. But my point is always to say that India is a fascinating country, but it's not a perfect country. Dr. Har's question of you to understand. So you don't give the wrong impression. Don't feel massively proud after this talk. India is so great. Yes, it's diverse, unique, but it's a work in progress. It's an old civilization, a young nation, with all kinds of fault lines in it. And the two major fault lines are caste and women. There is a great amount of discrimination against this country. There is a great amount of discrimination against women still in this country. Under law, they are all equal, which is what Dr. Shah was talking about. Before the Constitution, women didn't have the right to vote, women didn't have the right to choose their marriage partners, women didn't have the right to divorce a brutal husband, women didn't have the right to inherit property. All these are new. Before the Constitution, Dalits didn't have the right to live where they chose, they didn't have the right to take jobs, so all that has changed. But law is one thing and social practice is another. And law and for social change to take place, it's not enough just to change the law, to change social practice as well. And I think what is happening in our cities today is violence against women, which is disturbing. I think that's something we have to combat and challenge. And there have been some cases that got more attention, such as the Nirmala, but there are others too. And we still remain a work in progress. There still remain deep fault lines, inequality, particularly of caste and gender. And unless those are tackled constitutionally, not through the use of arms, not violently, constitutionally, I think we will continue to remain a flawed democracy. In that same book, India After Gandhi, I said, we are a 50-50 democracy, which means we are not perfect. We should become a 60-40 or 70-30 democracy, that will be better. We are still a work in progress, especially in the realm of the emancipation of women and the emancipation of Dalits and Adivasis. I think we still have quite a lot.
But actually, I'm proud that I'm an Indian woman because legally I'm equal.
Yeah, but that's true. So, but still, you see, I think it's important not to exaggerate the level of inequality. Women, you are more equal compared to Pakistan or compared to Norway or Canada. Let me tell you that. All right. So I think we still have some.
Fascinating the beauty of India's pluralism, but India is a challenging situation right now.
Yeah.
What is your vision of the future? Whether the present challenges to pluralism will mark our pluralism down, secularism down, or what?
No, there is a challenge. I think there is a challenge. You're right, absolutely right. There is a challenge. I think the challenge is to linguistic pluralism that Tamils took care of. You know, as the letter I quoted, no one is going to impose Hindi on us anymore. Right. Even English, people wanted to abolish English. Ram Singh Yadav was against English, but he sent us to an English school. In the 1960s, when there was a famous debate between Lohia and Rajaji about this, Rajaji said Saraswati gave birth to all languages, so English is also an Indian language. So we have won that battle. So one battle, I think, on linguistic pluralism, but on religious pluralism, yes. Hindu majoritarianism remains a challenge. And there is a kind of imitative majoritarianism, where some right-wing Hindus feel, if Pakistan can become Islamic, I shouldn't become Hindu. Right? And that is fine, because look at Pakistani, you want to go down there. So, things like all these silly remarks about beef, these are worrying. I think these are unproductive. They divert us from the main job of economic growth and inclusion and social welfare. I think I hope the Prime Minister should speak out more. He hasn't. They are worries, and this will go a little worse because now we have a UP election coming in 2017, where they will attempt to polarize Hindus and Muslims. Amit Shah on the Hindu side will work with Azam Khan on the Muslim side to polarize. So they are worried. You're absolutely right. On the question of religious pluralism, we have to be very careful, very vigilant, and our leadership, particularly our top leadership, must speak out much more. On that, I'm glad you made that point.
Independence, only two parties have been majority, they have been ruling. That's BJP and Congress.
Yeah.
So in future, will there be introduction of a new party, like challenges which you are saying, will they face them, or will the new parties will come up with just spin-offs of BJP and Congress? Will they do any new era?
So again, it's hard to predict. The thing is, I don't generally venture into I use the past to illuminate the present. If I was to speak about the future, I would stop being a historian and become an astrologer. Of course, that would be a profitable change of profession. Astrologers in India learn much more than historians. But I hesitate to. But I think what we are seeing now is something different. We are seeing the emergence at the central level of what you would call a BJP dominated system. We once had a Congress dominated system, only one national party and many small other parties. Now the Congress cannot come because Rahul Gandhi is in government. He can't run. So unless they throw him out, they can't. So the last 15 or 20 years, you're going to see a really one-party dominant system with some challenges. But the mistake we make is to look at everything to the lens of Delhi. India is a union of 29 states, and we have to look at it through the prism of states. Even if we can't have a healthy two-party competition in the center, the Aam party could have grown, but now we'll have to see. Maybe Punjab will do well and slowly they will grow. But whatever happens in the center, in the states, we must have to. Uninterrupted rule by one party in the state is bad. 30 years of left front rule in West Bengal ruined West Bengal. The communists ruled for 30 years in West Bengal. But in Kerala, they alternated. Communist, Congress. And that's one reason Kerala is doing much better. Because two-party rule means a two-party system where you alternate the governments. Means that you keep a check on the other. If you're in power for 30 years, corruption, authoritarian that eats you. You have to look at states and cultivate two-party systems in states. Canada is a model state in terms of women's rights, health, education, partly because it is a healthy two-party system. Tamil Nadu also has a healthy two-party system. And we have to look at the federal system and cultivating two-party systems in states. Because now, especially with economic liberalization, more and more responsibilities on the state. You know, education, health, investment, jobs. So, unfortunately, the national media is too Delhi-centered. You know, during the time of the election, 2014, there were all these debates, Modi or Rahul. And I said at that time, what India needs is not one great charismatic leader at the center. India needs 10 or 12 good chief ministers. No, that will be much better run. So I think it's sometimes a mistake to look at it only from the lens of Delhi.
Good morning, sir. I'm a great fan of you. I have seen a lot of videos on YouTube. I have a question. After independence, India chose to be an industrial economy. But the platform on which India became independent, agriculture-based economy was the right choice, I feel. Because India was not having the suitable infrastructure for that time. However, China chose agriculture-based economy, and then on the 1970s they chose to be industrialized. So how do you think that decision at that time has influenced the country, and could it have been better in terms of what we are now?
Yeah, I think probably the critical mistake was not in the 50s of when we chose a kind of state-oriented model of economic development, but in the 70s. By the 70s, we had built up the infrastructure, and we could have opened up the economy. But Indira Gandhi further nationalized and closed the economy. So in the 1970s, China opened up in 78. In the late 60s, all the South Korea, Taiwan, they are all started opening up. So I think for the late 1970s, we should have opened up. But though more emphasis could have been placed on agriculture, it is true that Nehru placed less emphasis on agriculture. Shastri corrected it. You know, Shastri's famous slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. I wrote a column about on Shastri's 50th death anniversary a month ago. I said Shastri coined one slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, and he made it effective. Our Prime Minister coined the slogan a week, not a slogan a day. I said, let him learn from Shastri. Let him stop. Some slogans are very good. First Bharat is a good slogan. Start India is a good slogan. But I'm sure by next week there will be a new slogan. Let him stop here and implement that. So Shastri recognized that we had neglected agriculture. Hence Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. He recognized we had neglected defense. Hence we had suffered a defeat at China. So Jai Jawan. Shastri also had begun to open out the economy. You know, if Shastri had lived 5 years longer, we would have been a different country. You know, the early death that hurt us most was probably Shastri. And in my book, India, I talk quite a lot about it. And by the way, he was totally secular. You know, he was completely secular. To go back to the point that Professor Mohammadi made. When there was a war against Pakistan in 1965, the BBC radio did a story saying Hindu India war against Muslim Pakistan. Shastri gave a speech. This is there in the article I wrote. Shastri gave a speech in the Ramlila Maidan when the war was going on. On his right was a famous Delhi congressman who had been gone to jail in the Quit India movement called Mir Mushtaq Ahmed. He was on his right. On his left was Frank Antony, who was a famous lawyer and a member of the Constituent Assembly. He said, this is the difference between India and Pakistan. She was to my right and she was to my left. So Shastri was a remarkable person, and he would have opened up. Indira Gandhi, unfortunately, tightened up more nationalization. So the missed opportunity was in the 60s and 70s, not the 40s. Yeah.
With the recent news about Subhash Chandra Bose being in the limelight, could you please share some lesser known facts about what is it that we should really believe, or what is it that what could be the correct theory, looking into the past and what is being spoken about?
About Subhash Chandra Bose.
Yes.
Yeah, you said I gave a long interview, 2 interviews on TV. They may be on. If you go to my Twitter timeline, you'll get them. Have a look. Well, it's it's rather, I'm afraid it's rather disappointing. Subhash Bose died in August 1945. These are all ridiculous conspiracy theories. That's the first thing. These were motivated to tarnish the image of the Congress and to influence the West Bengal election. So, and they all kind of nonsensical letters invented that Nehru wrote this. These are complete lies and rubbish. The first thing is, Subhash Bose died in August 1945, and all proper professional historians believe this. The second thing is that Subhash Bose, for most of his life, was a member of the Congress party, and he was the comrade of Nehru, Patel, Azad, and Gandhi. He departed from them when the war broke out because he took the side of the Japanese. Whereas Gandhi and Nehru believed that the Japanese were even more brutal than the British, which is true. Because in China, what they had done was like what Hitler had done to the Jews. But anyway, that was a difference of agreement or difference of tactics. And both thought enemy is my friend. So I will join the Japanese to fight the British. Also, he disagreed with Gandhi on the question of non-violence. Gandhi believed that non-violence is the most effective and the most morally robust technique of resistance. If you use violence, this will lead to more violence. If you drive out the British through violence, next you will turn the gun on your own people. So there was these disagreements. Both went underground, and then from Afghanistan he went to Russia and to Germany and Italy, and finally he came to Singapore and Japan. When he started his Azad Hind Fauj, he named the brigades Gandhi Brigade, Azad Brigade, Nehru Brigade. That shows how much he admired Gandhi, Nehru and Azad. So there are a lot of mischievous propaganda put out by the right-wing elements on the Subhash Bose business, which I have tried my best to combat, but unsuccessfully or not fully successfully, because as it was famously said, a lie goes, in the 1970s, a British Prime Minister said this, 1970s, said, a lie goes halfway around the world before the truth has had the time to put its boots on. A lie goes halfway around the world. Now, in the age of Twitter and social media, the lie goes all the way around the world. So luckily, it allows me also for the truth to come back. So the truth is, he was a great patriot. He was a complete believer in pluralism, in Hindu-Muslim harmony. He detested Hindu fanatics totally, and but he and Gandhi disagreed on the question of violence, and that's why he fought. Yeah.
After Nehru's death, the most controversial or Lal Bahadur Shastri's death is also a kind of.
He had a heart attack and died. Don't you see this conspiracy theories are?
Yeah.
It's sad that he died. If he had had 5 years, had a heart condition. He was in a cold place. He was wearing a khadi dhoti and a heart attack and died. Absolutely good. So, and some of these conspiracy theories, they reveal. By the way, these conspiracy theories reveal a deep flaw in our character, in our national character. Because let's assume for a moment, let's assume that Shastri was poisoned in 1965. 50 years later, what have we done to uphold his legacy? Why have we taken it further? It's as if we want to outsource all our problems to Shastri or Bose. If Shastri was alive or Bose was alive, we'd be a great superpower and we would have to do nothing because enjoy the fruits of being a superpower. These conspiracy theories reveal some deep psychological flaw in our character, is what I believe. But as far as all the evidence goes, Shastri died a natural death, Bose died in a crash. Yeah.
Sir, hi sir, this is Ashwini. Sir, as you told, we, women of India, start to compare ourselves with women of UK, US or Norway or Western countries for that matter, rather comparing ourselves with the Pakistan, Afghanistan. But my idea is, what I think is, the idea of equality also comes from the idea of our culture, the culture we live with. We being the women of India has the richest culture. So is that true or is that okay? We comparing ourselves with the women of Norway or women of, yes?
Equality is not part of Indian culture, full stop. Pluralism is, equality is not. Hinduism is plural but not equal. So Hindus are historically free to worship many gods, but yeah, but okay, but they are unequal, right? Now, Islam is equal as far as men are concerned. There is no caste system, but women have to pray separately. In both Hinduism and in Islam, in terms of scripture and social practice, both Hinduism and Islam were, and to a great extent still are, patriarchal, strongly patriarchal. So the equality is a modern concept. Freedom of the press is a modern, no tutu mama. This is not television. No tutu mama. Next question. So okay, ask it. So I will tell you. Wait. But that does not mean, because that does not mean we can appreciate the beauties of our Hindu philosophical tradition, the beauties of our music, the beauties of our temple architecture. But let me tell you that anyone who seriously studied the scriptures of Hinduism will tell you Hinduism is plural but not equal. Which is why Gandhi said, when the Shankaracharyas wanted to excommunicate Gandhi because he fought against untouchability, because untouchability is in our scriptures. So don't delude yourself on this. The only way for a man to be equal in the Hindu tradition was to opt out, was to take sannyas. Or for a bhakti poet like Kabir to say, I don't care, I will not die in Banaras, because I don't believe in that. But women were always subordinated, they are still subordinated. And that is why our constitution was given to Ambedkar, who burnt the Manusmriti. The person who wrote the constitution burnt the Manusmriti. And why did he burn the Manusmriti? Because of what it said about caste and women. So you must be clear about this. You must not think like this. Doesn't matter if it's modern. It's necessary. Societies have to change, they have to evolve. They keep some part of our tradition. No, there are many wonderful things about Indian tradition, but equality of women is not.
Hello sir, my name is Anurag.
Yeah.
I want to ask a question regarding problem of Kashmir.
Yeah.
The rehabilitation of Kashmiri Pandits, efforts of rehabilitation, and ASPA, and the current political crisis in Kashmir. What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's a very complex question. If you have the time and the inclination, I would urge you to read my book India After Gandhi, because it has about 4 chapters on Kashmir. It's a complex issue. It will require a lot of patience, understanding, dialogue. India has right on Kashmir, Pakistan also has right on Kashmir. It's not clear whose right is better. A viable solution will involve changing the line of control into the actual boundary. And for the Pakistanis to give autonomy to their part of Kashmir, which they have suppressed, and for us to give autonomy to our part of the Kashmir Valley, which we have suppressed. But at the same time, there is the question of the Pandits. And the Pandits were expelled by the jihadi forces, and some kind of acknowledgement of injustice done to the Pandits must also be part of any reconciliation process. How it takes place, whether this be a township, but I think more has to be done on that regard. And too few Kashmiri politicians are willing to acknowledge openly injustice done to the Pandits. So the Indian state, the Indian army has done injustice to the Kashmiris as a whole, and ASPA must be withdrawn from some areas. But at the same time, if reconciliation has to be lasting, there has to be an acknowledgement among the Kashmiri population at large that injustice was done to their Pandit brothers and sisters. So it's patience, hard work, dialogue, and response, careful and responsible, and statement by all parties concerned. It will be a long process, because especially the jihadis in Pakistan don't want this. Modi goes to Lahore, there is an attack in Pathankot. Manmohan Singh starts talking to Musharraf about a permanent solution to Kashmir. There is the 26/11 attack on Mumbai. So that's also an external factor. But it's a complex process. It requires acknowledgement by both India and Pakistan that injustice has been done to Kashmir.
Sir, can music contribute in maintaining communal harmony in our country like India, which is having huge religious diversity.
Of course, but you see, not directly but indirectly. I mean, if you look at musical tradition, they are the greatest tribute to our citizen. You know, you will find in the great temple in Srinagar, Vaishnavite temple in Srinagar, which is holy to many Vaishnavites. You know, Sheikh Chinna Maulana, a great Muslim musician, a Nadasaram player. So it can. You know, you have, if you look at our bhakti traditions, they're all interwoven. You know, they're all interwoven. But only indirectly. Indirectly it can. Indirectly, yes. You have many examples in India of like Ravi Shankar was a Hindu, his guru was a Muslim. He lived in the same house as the guru, he cooked food for him, he ate food there. So there many, it can, but only indirectly. Ultimately, it can only do so much. Ultimately, religious harmony must come from the observance of the law, from the impartial police, and above all, from the political leadership eschewing inflammatory rhetoric. But music has a small role. You're right. It has a small role, but it has a role. Yeah.
Question? Thank you, Dr. Gowar.